This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we are tackling a really weighty subject, the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. We'll be focusing on chapter 5 of this pretty hefty history book here, but don't worry, we're going to make sure this is as interesting and as engaging as it is important. You know, we're talking about centuries of prejudice. I mean, we're talking about like absurd accusations of like poisoning wells during the Black Plague and like totally made-up documents about Jewish people plotting world domination. You really can't make this stuff up.
Well, actually, you'd be surprised. That's what's so fascinating and really disturbing about anti-Semitism. I mean, this isn't just some trend. This is a very deep-seated prejudice with roots that go all the way back to ancient times. And it really gained traction in Europe during the medieval period, which laid the groundwork for so many of the stereotypes and misinformation that we still see today.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're talking about the Middle Ages, the time of knights and castles.
Yep.
But also apparently rampant prejudice. So how did anti-Semitism manifest back then?
Well, imagine a world just consumed by fear and superstition. You know, the Black Death is ravaging Europe, wiping out entire communities. And in their desperation, people are searching for someone to blame. And guess who becomes the scapegoat?
Let me guess, the Jews.
Exactly. They get accused of intentionally poisoning wells, spreading the plague on purpose. It's this classic case of fear and ignorance, leading to the most illogical conclusions. And what's really scary is that this wasn't just some theory whispered in dark corners. Powerful institutions like the church played a significant role in spreading these myths.
Wait, hold on. The church, how were they involved?
Well, think about the Crusades. On the surface, they were religious expeditions to reclaim the Holy Land, but they also fueled a wave of violence against Jewish communities all across Europe. And some religious leaders even preached that Jews were enemies of Christ, which, of course, further legitimized this hatred and prejudice.
Wow. So the seeds of anti-Semitism were sown deep, even in the highest levels of society.
Yeah.
So how did this evolve over time?
Well, let's fast forward to 1492, a pivotal year. This is when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain issue a decree, the Alhambra Decree. It essentially forced all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or be expelled.
Okay, so we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
Where people were forced to prove their religious purity or face persecution.
You got it. And this expulsion from Spain, it had this ripple effect across Europe. Imagine being told that you have to choose between your faith and your homeland. Thousands of Jewish families were uprooted, forced to seek refuge in other countries. And sadly, this event really triggered a wave of anti-Semitism across the continent, with each country kind of developing its own unique brand of prejudice.
So this wasn't just a Spanish problem. It became a European-wide crisis.
Exactly. And this is where things start to get really nuanced. You see, while anti-Semitism had its roots in religious prejudice, it also morphed and adapted to fit the political and social landscape of different countries. Like, take Eastern Europe, for example. This is where we see the horrific rise of pogroms.
Okay, remind me what exactly was a pogrom?
A pogrom was a targeted, organized attack against a Jewish community, often with the tacit approval or even active participation of local authorities. Imagine mobs descending upon villages, looting homes, burning synagogues, and just brutally murdering innocent people, all fueled by this hatred and misinformation. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were state-sanctioned campaigns of terror.
That's absolutely horrific. It's hard to believe that such barbarity could exist even centuries ago.
And yet it did. And keep in mind, this is happening alongside the so-called Enlightenment, a period supposedly characterized by reason and progress. Even in a seemingly modern nation like France, the deep-seated nature of anti-Semitism becomes horrifyingly clear, with the Dreyfus Affair in the late 1800s.
Ooh, here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, I've got chills. This is a story that I know a little about, but I bet our listeners need a refresher.
Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish artillery officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason. The evidence against him was flimsy at best, fabricated at worst, but he became the target of a national witch hunt. This wasn't just about one man. It exposed the deep-seated anti-Semitism that permeated French society.
Right. That's like the whole country went mad, accusing this man based on nothing but prejudice and paranoia.
Yeah.
The media frenzy, the public trials, it all just highlights how quickly hatred can spiral out of control, even in a supposedly enlightened society.
Exactly. And speaking of how these ideas spread, we can't ignore the role of literature and propaganda, especially as we move into the 20th century and the rise of Nazi Germany.
Oh, absolutely. This is where things get really dark. I mean, everyone knows about Mein Kampf, Hitler's manifesto. But what other kinds of publications were fueling the fire of hatred during this period?
Well, there's Der Stürmer, for example.
Hmm?
Imagine a weekly newspaper widely circulated, filled with these hateful caricatures and completely fabricated stories designed to dehumanize Jewish people. It was essentially a propaganda machine disguised as journalism.
Wow. So they were basically normalizing hatred, making it part of everyday life. That's terrifying.
It was a calculated strategy to desensitize the public, to make them complicit in the demonization of an entire group of people. And they didn't just stop at newspapers. There was Juden sehen dich,
Yeah.
which translates to Jews are watching you. They even tried to use pseudoscience, claiming that Jewish people were biologically different, inherently dangerous.
It's like they took every existing stereotype, every conspiracy theory, and amplified it to a terrifying degree. Were there any other books that stand out?
Oh, plenty. There was Die Rothschilds, Aktien auf Waterloo, which played into existing conspiracy theories about Jewish economic control. And then there was Der ewige Jude, which means the eternal Jew, both a book and a film. It's filled with grotesque imagery designed to dehumanize and demonize Jews.
It's chilling to think about the impact these publications had, but there's one piece of propaganda in particular that I find utterly mind-boggling. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, yes, the Protocols. This is a textbook example of how fabricated information can have real-world devastating consequences. It's a fake document, a completely made-up account of a supposed Jewish plot for world domination.
Wait, people actually believe this? A document claiming that Jewish people were secretly controlling the world?
Sadly, yes. It was circulated widely in the early 20th century, and despite being completely debunked, was taken seriously by many, including some prominent figures.
That's unbelievable. It's like something out of a bad spy novel.
Yeah.
But this wasn't fiction. This was real life, and it had a real impact on how people perceived Jewish people.
It played on existing fears and prejudices, confirming people's worst suspicions about Jewish people. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It legitimized hatred, giving it a veneer of credibility.
You know, for our listeners, it might be easy to think, well, this is all terrible, but it's history. It's in the past. But that's exactly why understanding this history is so crucial, even if it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. This isn't just about learning about the past. It's about understanding the present. The echoes of this history are still felt today. And you're right, this isn't just ancient history, it's the foundation for understanding how anti-Semitism continues to manifest, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle even today.
That's what's so unsettling. It's like this ancient prejudice has shape-shifted over time, finding new ways to express itself. But if it's become more subtle, how can we even recognize it?
Yeah.
What should we be looking out for?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We can't just point to burning synagogues or blatant Nazi propaganda anymore, but those underlying themes, those tropes, they're often still there lurking beneath the surface.
Okay, so give us an example. What does modern-day anti-Semitism look like?
Well, think about those conspiracy theories we were talking about, like the protocols. They haven't disappeared. They've just found new platforms. The internet, particularly social media, has become a breeding ground for the spread of misinformation and hate speech.
It's like the medium has changed, but the message remains the same.
Mm.
Instead of pamphlets and newspapers, it's memes and viral videos. And it's not just confined to the dark corners of the internet. We see these coded messages seeping into mainstream politics, media commentary, even casual conversations.
Exactly. It's become more insidious, more coded. You'll hear dog whistles about globalists, about shadowy elites controlling the world, about financial conspiracies. These terms often function as stand-ins for Jewish, tapping into those age-old prejudices without explicitly saying it.
So it's like they're playing this dangerous word game using coded language to spread their message. But if it's so subtle, how do we fight back? How do we expose it for what it is?
That's where education and awareness become absolutely crucial. We need to understand the historical context, recognize the patterns, be able to decode the language of hate, and we need to be willing to call it out even when it's disguised as something else.
So we're talking about being critical thinkers, right? Questioning what we read and hear, especially online, because it's easy to get swept up in the outrage to accept things at face value without really digging deeper.
It's about being discerning, about asking ourselves, who benefits from spreading this information? What are their motives? Remember the protocols. That was a complete fabrication, yet it gained traction because it played into pre-existing fears and prejudices. We need to be vigilant, always questioning the sources of information and the agendas behind them.
So it's almost like being a history detective, right? Constantly questioning, analyzing, and looking for clues to understand the bigger picture. And this brings us back to why this deep dive is so important. It's not just about looking back. It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge and critical thinking skills to combat prejudice in the present.
Exactly. This isn't just Jewish history. It's a lesson for all of us about the dangers of unchecked prejudice, the power of misinformation, and the importance of standing up for what's right.
Because if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to remember that anti-Semitism isn't just a problem for Jewish people to deal with. It's a threat to the very fabric of a just and equitable society.
Because prejudice against one group inevitably opens the door for prejudice against others. It creates a climate of fear and intolerance that affects everyone.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all forms of hate and understanding that combating anti-Semitism is part of a broader fight for social justice.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to make a difference? Besides, brushing up on their history.
Well, awareness is the first step.
Yeah.
But it can't end there. We need to move from awareness to action. Supporting organizations that combat anti-Semitism is crucial. There are numerous groups doing incredible work, from monitoring hate speech to advocating for policy changes to educating the public.
And it's not just about financial contributions, right? There are so many ways to get involved. We can volunteer our time, raise awareness in our communities, educate ourselves on how to be effective allies.
You're absolutely right. It's a collective effort. And on a more personal level, we can all strive to be more empathetic and understanding in our daily interactions.
That's so important. Challenging stereotypes, calling out microaggressions, even in casual conversations, can make a real difference. It's about creating a culture where prejudice is simply not tolerated.
Exactly. It all starts with each of us. Being mindful of the language we use, the jokes we tell, the assumptions we make. It's about recognizing our own biases and actively working to dismantle them.
It's about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding where prejudice has no place.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and respected regardless of their background or beliefs. And that's a future worth fighting for.
Listening to all of this, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Centuries of prejudice, countless examples of hatred. It can feel like an insurmountable problem.
It's true that anti-Semitism has been a persistent and insidious force throughout history. But I think it's crucial to remember that we're not powerless against it. We've been talking about education, critical thinking, speaking out against injustice, and supporting organizations fighting this fight. But I think what can be even more powerful is changing the way we approach conversations in our daily lives.
What do you mean?
We need to shift from a reactive stance to a proactive one. Instead of just waiting for anti-Semitism to rear its ugly head, we can actively foster a culture of understanding and empathy.
So it's about creating an environment where prejudice simply doesn't have a chance to take root. But how do we do that?
It starts with self-reflection. Each of us needs to examine our own biases, even the unconscious ones. Ask yourself, where do my ideas about different groups come from? Am I perpetuating stereotypes, even unintentionally? It's not about being perfect, it's about being aware and willing to learn.
That's such an important point. It's not about pointing fingers or shaming people. It's about having open, honest conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly. And remember, those conversations don't have to be grand sweeping pronouncements. Sometimes the most impactful changes happen on a smaller scale.
So like challenging a joke that plays on stereotypes, or speaking up when someone makes a generalization about an entire group of people. It's about those everyday moments where we can choose to be allies.
You got it. It's about shifting the narrative one conversation at a time.
And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, being critical thinkers. Questioning the information we consume, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Right, because the fight against anti-Semitism, like all forms of prejudice, is ultimately a fight for a more just and equitable world. And that's a fight that requires all of us to be engaged, informed, and active participants.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We spent some time unpacking the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that totally made-up document that somehow gained widespread belief.
It's a truly chilling example of how misinformation can be weaponized to fuel hatred.
And it makes you wonder, if seemingly rational people could be swayed by such an obvious fabrication, what does that tell us about the power of misinformation even today? I mean, we're bombarded with information constantly from all directions. How do we sift through it all and determine what's real, what's biased, and what's downright dangerous?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? In this age of social media and instant information, where truth and fiction often blur, it's more important than ever to be critical consumers of information, to question our assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of anything that confirms our existing biases.
We all have a responsibility to be discerning, to think critically, and to stand up for what's right. Because the fight against anti-Semitism is a fight for a more just and equitable world, and that's a fight worth having every single day.
Absolutely. It's a fight for humanity itself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's inspired you to learn more, to challenge your own assumptions, and to be an active force for positive change. Until next time.